This Ding Liren game is an absolute masterpiece, a modern Immortal and perhaps his most famous game to date. He played it in 2017, it was in the Chinese Chess League. Now he had the black pieces here, he was playing against Bai Jinji with the white pieces, who was rated 2500 odd. Ding was already 2750, so he outgunned him quite seriously, but the way he dismantles him in this game is just insane. So let's see what happened here. White kicked off with pawn to d4, we had knight f6, pawn c4, and Ding plays the Nimzo Indian, pawn to e6. So knight c3 goes down the main line, bishop to b4, and now knight f3 played, many different variations of course. We had castles from Ding, and now here the bishop actually comes outside the pawn chain. We've seen a lot of that bishop staying at home recently in top level Grandmaster chess with the pawn on e3 instead. So c5 now from Ding. You can also go d5 there. There's many different ways to strike in the centre as black. That's why the Super GMs love the Nimzo, such a flexible defence. And now here white does go pawn to e3. We had takes on d4, and the most common recapture here is taking back with the pawn. There are very few games where the queen recaptures, and yet it's the top engine move when you actually run this one. And the reason I guess human players don't like to do this is you run straight into knight c6. After the queen drops back, it came to d3 here. Well, now black can strike. First pawn h6 came, kicked the bishop, and then d5. And this is what Ding's really playing for in this position, is initiative. And we'll see in a moment how he really seizes it. So white doesn't actually take there or develop. Instead, rook to d1 was played. Still a good move, still a top engine move. Both players well prepped here. And now this is where Ding really turns the screw. So you can take on c4, say white takes back, queen e7, and white's a bit better, but black is solid. But Ding doesn't go for this. He wants to really take over the game, so he pushes this g5 move, kicks back that bishop, and then he goes knight to e4. So he's pressuring that one on c3. Queen a5 could also be coming. So this is the compensation for black compromising the pawn structure. You want a quick attack. Now white drops back with knight to d2 here. A very common idea in these structures. You break that pin, you ask the knight what it's doing from e4, and this is where Ding plays really precisely here. So he doesn't want to trade the wrong pieces, then white can get developed and will be doing quite well long term with the compromised pawns. So Ding drops his knight back to c5 here, he keeps that tension, kicks the queen back, and now he gets this d4 break. But this is really dangerous of course, because white isn't obliged to actually move that knight on c3 or recapture and bring in the knight. Instead, white can go knight to f3, which was played. You open the rook against the queen, and now there's a lot of pressure on this pawn. And it actually forces Ding to go pawn to e5, and this whole way of playing for black is very double-edged because you're giving pawns here to get your pieces out. Now the bishop could capture here. I don't want to go down all of those sidelines. It's such a rich game, this one. Instead, white captured with the knight. Both moves were playable. Knight takes is actually the top engine choice here. But now Ding doesn't recapture that knight. Instead, here he unveils his whole idea. He actually takes this knight on c3. Really exceptional stuff. Just giving up his queen on d8, which white duly snaps off. So what's Ding got in mind? Well, he now takes on b2, giving a discovered check here, and now white goes wrong. You should actually drop this rook back to d2, cover the check, but from a human perspective, it's not easy to see that this is okay, because after rook to d8, how are you defending that rook? Well, you can actually drop with knight to f3, but it looks really scary because that knight can be eliminated. Now going pawn to g4 isn't actually as good as bishop to g4. With bishop to g4 you connect the rooks, that's important in some lines. So bishop to g4 would be black's main move, then white can take on b2, you take on f3 here, eliminate the defender, and without going through all the variations, best for white here is takes on f3, Then you can take on d2, and say you had a line like this: queen recaptures, bishop takes, king takes. White actually gives back the queen, but emerges a pawn up and has the bishop pair. However, after say rook to d8 check, it's roughly an equal position because white's got all of these development issues on the king side, as we can see here. So rook d2 was the best way to go. But as we can see from that variation, it's not easy to calculate all of that out. And so instead of dropping the rook back, the king now staggered up the board, came to e2, and Ding snapped off here, and now he's better. When you run this with the engine, he's a couple of pawns better, and the king hunt is on. So the queen took on b2 here, knight a4 now played, hits the queen, and after it sidestepped to c2, now the check from c3 came, and the king is forced up the board here. And this is where Ding just plays an exceptional move. Like sacking your queen isn't enough for one game, can you find what he played here to continue the mating attack? So in this position, Ding played rook to d4. Just an exceptional idea, looking to push this g4 and checkmate the king. Now what happens if you take the rook? Well, then we hop in, we fork king and queen, so that's no good. And how do you actually stop this checkmating idea? Well, white goes h3 to stop that one. h5 now renewed the threat, and that's why the bishop dropped to h2, because now when Ding plays this move, he's given the king some room. It can hide on g3 here, and now once again, how do you continue the attack? I mean, the first logical move you look at here as black, you look for checks, of course, in these kind of positions. Well, what happens if you go knight e4 check? Well, then the king can actually come to f4 here, and there's not actually a good way to deliver a discovered check. I mean, if you jump the knight away, well, then pawn takes rook. So this is the problem with checking too soon, and that's why, again, Ding finds this exceptional idea. Again, if you want to pause, please do. He goes rook to d2 here, kicking that queen once again, and again it's immune because then you check here, once again you win the queen. So after it moved away, well, now Ding checks from e4, and this time the king came to h4, because if it steps to the f file here, well, now you take on f2 with check. This is the difference with having the rook on d2 as opposed to d4. If the king takes here, well, this is actually leading to mate with bishop f5, king staggers here, and the rook checks on the d file. Yes, some pieces can block, but this is actually a beautiful mate using the minors and the heavy. Really, really nice. So that's why the king can't actually take the knight on e4 here. And say you tried to block this one with knight to f3, the problem is you just start giving up way too much material. Again, if king takes knight, then pawn takes pawn, completely winning. If instead you go g4 to try and keep lines shut, well, then knight d2 check, and the attack just completely rages on. Black is completely winning this position. So that's why we didn't have the king actually stepping to the f file here. Instead it came to h4, and now bishop e7 check continues the hunt. It took on h5 here, and now again it's just not straightforward. How do you continue this mating attack? How would you play? Well, Ding finds a really nice idea here. He just nudges the king up to g7, and he just says, I'm not actually in a rush. I'm bringing my rook to the h file. I'm going to mate you after I move this bishop, swing the rook over. So that's why bishop to f4 was played, preparing to block that idea here. Now this bishop developed. The bishop checked from h6. It forces the king to h7. And because white has now bought some time, you can crash through on b7 with the queen, and you hit 1, 2, 3 pieces here. You're threatening to actually take this rook. But what does Ding do? He just ignores that. He doesn't protect any of the pieces. He takes on f2 with the rook. Again, just a beautiful idea, because now if you take this rook in the corner, well, this is actually checkmate from g3 using the knight. That's why Ding took this pawn, because now the pawn can't capture on g3. And because this bishop is slicing, you've got king and pawn here, it's just completely boxed in. So this knight g3 check idea, checkmate, is such a powerful threat that the only way white can actually cover that is with bishop to g5 here. You stop this bishop slicing across, because now if you check, well, the king has some space. So Ding didn't check here. Instead, he brought the rook to h8. Now he's renewing all of those threats along the h-file, moving the king. And now there's just really no good moves for white here. We had takes on f7 as a try, the knight took, looking to capture the rook when it checks, but now you're not even forced to do that. Instead, Ding sets up a beautiful mate. He first checks from g6 with the bishop, the king took on g4 here, and now he chucks in this knight e5 check. Why is he giving away a whole piece? Well, he wants to actually get access to this h6 square, as we'll see, and at the moment that's protected by 2 pieces here. But now when the knight takes, only the bishop is protecting that square. Because now bishop f5 check can be played, the king moves away, and now king g8 unleashes that check, and because you distracted the knight, you can't block the h-file, the bishop had to go, and now Ding checkmates from here. He hops into g3. I mean, how often do you see that kind of checkmate? You're using the minor pieces. So a stunning game from Ding. If you want to see another amazing game from him, click here. Thanks very much for watching. See you soon.